Take a look at the sense of what forest and outdoor recreation are these days. It's actually kind of a strange thing. Like, you think about the idea of paying a lot of money or throwing your ticket into a lottery system for like a big game hunting tag, elk, moose, bear, something like that. Moose tags in the state of Vermont go like that. Bear tags in Illinois go like that. Elk tags all across the Intermountain West go like that. And it's not a particularly comfy experience, right? Wild elk have a flight distance of greater than 1,600 yards, 1 mile. That is, if they scent you in the wild, they're going to start responding to that, moving away, encircling the young, stuff like that, moving into a protective stance from quite a distance. And open country weather conditions during elk season in southern Wyoming and northern Colorado and in the Intermountain West, they're pretty difficult sometimes. It's not exactly, well, let's go throw out a beach towel and, catch some rays and bring down an elk. It's cold. You are completely exposed to the elements at high elevation in some cases, and or relatively high elevation compared to us here in southern Illinois. And people are spending thousands of dollars to do it, which is weird. Usually we spend a lot of money and time and effort making money so that we can trade that money for things like comfort, convenience, ease. And so the idea of working really hard, the idea of things like serious leisure, like the more gonzo forms of forest and outdoor recreation, is kind of a contradiction in terms. Leisure is supposed to be, in most people's minds, relaxing to some extent, so why do we have folks that go hard? Why do we have things like Duck Dynasty, where there's a whole subculture around not just hunting, not just waterfowl hunting, not just duck hunting, but like this TV show with a cult following about a family that is super into making duck calls? Yeah? Like, that's a thing. These people made a lot of money and got a lot of clout, as the youth these days say, from going really hard into a super, super narrow, tiny little, like, fragment of a fragment of a fragment, or a submarket of a submarket of a submarket of hunting, of forest and outdoor recreation, of leisure, that it's a thing. When you say Duck Dynasty, everybody kind of knows whom you're talking about, and sort of all the connotations along with that. You picture a kind of person, a particular skin tone, a particular presence or absence of beard, a particular style of clothing, right? Like, we have all of this stuff built up on top of going out to cold, wet, windy places and sitting still for a while and hoping you get something for the huge amount of money you paid for your hunting tag and so forth. So that's weird. Like, most of us trying to earn that bread or that cheddar, as the youth say, to avoid being exposed to the elements and stuff like that. So how did we get here? How did we get to this spot? Question, John.
Well, wouldn't it be more or less like they capitalize on, like you said, the fragment, but they also brought to light the hunting side? Wouldn't you say that of Duck Dynasty, where they expanded it to what it is today, bigger?
Yes. So modern mass media shines a hard spotlight on interesting and peculiar things like subcultures that show up. So, for example, we have things like professional outdoorswomen who get sponsorships. We've talked a lot about Red Bull and how they sponsor a ton of outdoor races, aerobatics. They sponsored Felix Baumgartner's skydiving from space, I don't know, 6-8 years ago, whenever that was. and like paid for the development of a literal spacesuit and a space capsule attached to a really huge weather balloon to bring him up to the edge of Earth's atmosphere so he could jump back down, just for the sake of it. Just for the sake of, in Red Bull's perspective, promoting energy drinks. Red Bull gives you wings. Let's get you to the edge of the atmosphere and show you what is possible at the human limit of survivability. As an interesting side note to that effort, Red Bull and the aeronautical engineers making Felix Baumgartner's essentially flight suit / space suit, it's a pressure suit, and his parachute and stuff like that, they weren't totally sure what was going to happen when he went transonic. That is, at sea level at least, when you're going more than about 750 miles an hour, you break the sonic barrier, you get a sonic boom and stuff like that. You create a pressure wave from the compression of the air around you, and that translates to sound. You get the sonic boom and so forth. So the question was, is Felix Baumgartner going transonic at our upper atmosphere? Because he was high enough up that the atmosphere is basically non-existent, and there's not a lot of air resistance, so he went way faster than terminal velocity for a human close to ground level, which is about 350 miles an hour, way faster than that. And they weren't quite sure if it was going to be like over microwaving a burrito, like if the shockwave would just pulp his body and he'd be a thin red mist inside the spacesuit. Like, they weren't totally sure what was going to happen. You're going to run a lot of simulations, but until you do the thing, like wrap up a watermelon in a simulated spacesuit and push that out, see what happens to it, you don't know. And so they took a risk. They strapped something like 40 or 50 cameras to him and the high altitude pod that he jumped out of. And the whole thing was live streamed, and it was tape delayed several seconds so that somebody could hit the big red button if he just totally exploded from the frictional or the shockwave forces involved.
But they also need to get like 60 different angles of it happening in case, like, what is something
at 1,000 frames a second, yeah, in Ultra HD. Why not? Yeah. So that's weird. Like, most of us don't wake up each morning and think, you know what? Today's the day I'm going to continue building towards jumping out of a space capsule and seeing if I survive the landing. So how did we get there? How on earth do we get from kind of this ancient era sense of things out to a sense of, let's see, swap these displays here. There we go. How do we get to this place of stuff like that not only being possible, but desirable to the point that an energy drink company would spend millions of dollars and fund years of research in order to position Felix Baumgartner to do that promotional stunt? The same thing is true for older generations as well, kind of leading up to that. In my parents' generation, it was folks like Evel Knievel. Show of hands, has anybody ever heard the name Evel Knievel?
Shit, we saw him jump live across the main king.
Exactly. Why?
Because it was fun.
Exactly. But that's a strange thing.
And he broke his leg.
Does anybody know who Travis Pastrana is? All right, so Travis Pastrana was like a professional racer, rally car driver, and stuff like that, like stunt, bicyclist, and so forth. And Travis Pastrana has been in so many wrecks that he is basically more medical titanium than he is bone at this point. The guy is busted. But he's made a career out of, he's made a pretty good living out of throwing his body at these insane stunts in sort of Evel Knievel style things. You know, live fast, die young, leave a pretty corpse, sort of a James Dean style life. And to most of us, that doesn't make sense. But to some portion of the population, it not only makes sense, it's extremely desirable. So, the history of forest and outdoor recreation is very much an exploration of what on earth? How do we get to like yeeting Felix Baumgartner from space to the surface of the planet? How do we get to things like drone racing leagues with head-mounted virtual reality style displays and people racing little drone quadcopters through empty warehouses and parking garages and stuff like that at extremely high speeds? How do we get to a place of things like Bionicle revolutionizing toys and so forth? How do we get to this place of our culture and our subcultures within that being what they are, when we are, and how we are, and so forth? So, in order to answer these questions, we gotta go all the way back to the beginning. Back to the bad old days when life expectancy was on average somewhere below 40 years of age, and you would have typically about twice as many kids in your family as you wanted to survive, given relatively high attrition rates and so forth, and just kind of deal with the fact that humans have one of the lowest birth rate survival rates for mothers based on fetal cranial radius to pelvic aperture size. Like, it's risky to live in the ancient era, and so that informs how we lived in the ancient era. Let's talk through what that was. So, in talking about the ancient era, we're just going to use very, very broad terms and dates. The point of this is not to make you write down tables of dates and locations. It's more to get a sense of what are the big threads, what are the common themes across multiple ancient cultures and then more recent cultures that get us to where we are today. So, you're not ever going to be asked on the final exam or whatever, you know, what specific year were the 7 Wonders of the World completed as a set and so forth. That's not important. What is important is, what is human nature? What do we see that is common across the Romans? And before them, the Persians, and before them, the ancient Mesopotamians, and before them, the sort of Babylonians were in that era as well, around 1000 BC. So they're a little bit later. And before that, going back to 17,000 before the Common Era, at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, which is where a lot of the world's major cultures of that region have their creation stories and so forth. All right, let's jump into it. So, in Mesopotamia, we're talking 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. So this is getting into solidly the ancient, like the early Egyptian culture time period, although this is a little bit east of that. In modern day Iraq and Iran, close to Afghanistan, and places like that, kind of at the north end of the Arabian Peninsula. So this is a pretty big thing. The Fertile Crescent, the Tigris, and the Euphrates River, 2 of the 4 rivers listed as flowing out of the Garden of Eden, for those of you coming from a Christian or Catholic background, Protestant or Catholic background. This is right there. This is right there, okay? And that's not a coincidence. The ancient Mesopotamians were among the first to set up continuously inhabited cities. So shifting from a hunter-gatherer and semi-permanent colony or religious site set up kind of before the last ice age was over. At 17,000 BCE, we have folks who are mostly nomadic, and they are at times what looks like a harvest festival or maybe like a spring festival. People gather at a place with some of the first permanent structures, some of the first known permanent structures that look to be not permanent settlements, but like temple sites where everybody, you know, all the tribes gather once a year and everybody trades sons and daughters, so there's intermarrying and everybody doesn't get all inbred and so forth. And then you go off and do your hunter-gatherer thing all over Asia Minor, which is sort of the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? This is good enough for a really long time. And then we get the invention of crop agriculture, which leads to functional animal agriculture around this time, 4000 to 2000 BCE or BC, depending on your theology. So 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, and some of the very first recorded kings, queens, emperors, pharaohs, they start to, as a function of their royalty, as a display of their power, they present to the world as what we would call a flex these days. This would be an overt geopolitical gesture back in the day, a flex to us. They present a version of nature that is tamed. In a time period where you don't know that illnesses come from genetic anomalies, they come from bacteria, viruses, and protozoans, and higher order parasites like worms. The world is a nasty and brutish place. A lot of people, if you survive to about age 30, 35, which is considered like full-on middle age, like jump the shark, you're getting pretty old, you're getting to a place of dying of tooth infections. We don't have dentists back then, not really. In fact, we don't have modern dentistry until about 1930, 1940, right? 4,000 years after this is done. So this era is pretty wild in a lot of ways. And we'll see it's not until about 3,000 years after this, with Genghis Khan, the Mongols, slaughtering people across Asia, that we've started to modify the surface of the earth enough to impact climate in a measurable way. So, we are scraping towns and settlements and religious sites, consolidating power into cities. We can have people living in permanent cities with the advent of crop and then animal agriculture. And so, leisure looks really pretty different than what you and I understand to be leisure. The 99.99% of everybody never gets access to this. In fact, may never physically see this, because these gardens, if you want to think about some of the seven wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, there's a big wall around it. And it looks like, from what archaeological excavations have been happening in what is now understood to be the Babylon ziggurat sites, these gardens were basically big hanging planters like your mom and dad have on their back porch. Okay, so the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were like around one big building. And that was considered a wonder of the ancient world. That's how different and hard life was at that time. It took a tremendous amount of work and human slave labor to pipe and pump that water for those hanging gardens up to the top of that temple ziggurat. So temple ziggurat is like a step pyramid, shaped kind of like this. Okay? And imagine these hanging gardens in big cauldron-like structures, kind of like this. Water is 1 ton per cubic meter. So to get water up hundreds of feet and down to this, it takes a lot of people. We don't have any electric pumps. We don't have any gas power pumps. We don't have any steam power at this point. That's not for another couple of thousand years. So this is a flex for everybody to look upon the works of Ozymandias and despair, to be like, wow, we have the greatest kings, we have the best kings, very high IQ, lots of energy, and so forth, okay? The sense of being able to command nature, to conquer it, to take on a role that is adjacent to, or in some cultures, immediately physically proximal or spiritually proximal to being a god, means that you have control over life and death. Look, I can make things bloom at the top of a big tower. Okay? And then for the rest of us, the other 99.99% of everybody in these cities, we're the slaves. We're the enslaved peoples. We are the ones doing the animal agriculture. We are the ones dying young of tooth infections. When you look back at burial sites of some of these ancient cities, and in particular their cemeteries or burial pits, you see a ton of broken jaws from tooth extractions. People were so desperate, when you got a cavity, they'd rip the tooth out so hard it would break your jaw as well.
The fuck?
So this was life back then, okay? It doesn't really lead to a Travis Pastrana or Danny McGaskill, a mountain biking stunting guy, kind of a life way or vibe, right? It's different, okay? So leisure, at least any recorded sense of leisure whatsoever, the only record we have, the only sense of it we have is with royalty, which is not to say that everybody else had to work, 160 hours a week and sleep a few minutes standing in the bread line each day, but we don't really know very well one way or the other, okay? This is when the first musical instruments are being invented. Basic things like drums, lutes, lyres, yeah.
What you're saying is this is the bar pretty low for us to keep raising.
Yeah. Kind of like the old Saturday Night Live sketch, Lowered Expectations. It's just like some real losers in the VHS dating scene. All right. So these Hanging Gardens of Babylon, again, about 1,000 years after the fall of the Mesopotamian Empire, or kind of a spiritual successor to it, this is a big deal. This is how a lot of early cultures over in Southeast Asia, there's 4,000 to 6,000 years of continuous, what we would recognize today as mainland Chinese culture. They have similar things going on. Think about emperors being buried with these ornate, terracotta soldier armies, stuff like that. And power, leisure, free time, all flowing to a very few people, and everybody else working their ass off to support that system. Okay? In India, where we have thousands of years of continuous records, it was the same kind of a thing. Royal rec areas in sub-Saharan Africa, the most wealthy individuals in human history, Mansa Musa, had just unbelievable, unthinkable amounts of wealth, and everybody else kind of on the struggle-thon. India is a little bit unusual among its peer cultures, ancient India, the Dravidians and so forth. They did have an early idea of what would later become, as of the advent of the United States, or the second half of the United States, time-wise, the idea of public access rec areas. So this was more like small scale, like Carbondale City Parks type things, right? Several acres, maybe, and so forth. Nothing like what we kind of take for granted today with places like the Shawnee National Forest, okay? So, in ancient China, we see pretty good records of, and moving closer to us in time by another 500 or 600 years, we have a much bigger sense of, with their records, how leisure, how sports, how festivals and so forth still reflected among the general population attention to and emphasis on kind of the royal or imperial sort of structuring of life. So horsemanship competitions, a big deal in ancient China. In Han and Qin Chinese cultures back then, this was a big deal. And in exactly the same way, and close to around the same time, the ancient Greeks are spinning up what we call the Olympics these days. And the Olympics and these horsemanship and these dragon boat festivals, things like firework catching, these are ways to train for army.
Firework catch. So you throw a firework and say, catch, bitch.
Yeah, kind of. We'll see a medieval version of this coming up about a century or a millennium later called bull baiting. So the idea here is in the Olympics and in ancient mainland China and other analogous cultures around the same time, if you want to sort of funnel all that creative, restless energy of your serfs and peasants who, should be working harder, you can surface the most athletic, the most militarily able of those to basically recruit into the army and bring up through the ranks and train up and keep people fit, keep these skills among the populace so that you have access to them when you need them to raise armies, which is a fairly regular thing. Leisure looks like low-key military training. Exact same tactic, no pun intended, with the launch thousands of years later of, America's Army, the first-person shooter game. That went over like a fart in the shower with some folks who were like anti-war and stuff like that. Like video games to recruit people to serve in the military. Some folks did not like that. Whatever. Have whatever opinion you like about it. So there's a sense of armies are a big deal. Agriculture, a big deal. We use our armies to take over more land so we can do more agriculture and have more material wealth flowing to our capital cities, our military citadel, our fortified cities, and so forth. So religion and military practice are both harnessing leisure. Harnessing skills like, backpacking isn't a whole lot different than marching, rucking, and so forth. Making a fire, hunting, is not a whole lot different than turning that same horse-mounted bow and arrow onto an opposing army. So, we have the ancient Greeks, and followed by that, the ancient Romans, kind of getting after the same thing in the same way for the same reasons. Okay, so leisure, outdoor forest recreation, you gotta understand, most of the world is not tamed like it is now. The world is a far larger, wilder, less certain, less safe place to venture out into. We don't have quick-dry clothing. We don't have GPS navigation. We don't even have good maps until like the 1800s. CE. This is like well before that, okay? So Aristotle, running around in his toga, formalizes this idea of using recreation not to have fun, not to relax, not to connect with people, to be a part of a subculture, like jumping out of space pods to skydive down to the planet. He calls it recreation, one form of the disinterested cultivation of personality.
Basically saying you're very lazy.
Yeah. Go out, train for the Olympics, because it's good for you physically. Okay? Go out, learn how to wrestle. Turkish and Greek, wrestling was a
Clothing optional.
clothing optional, very clothing optional. A lot of oil used. It was,
Jesus, stop.
this is a whole other scene, okay? But that sense of physical fitness, right? Wrestling as an activity burns about 4,000 calories an hour, okay? A pound of fat is between 3,000 and 7,000 calories. So you can burn a pound of fat per hour wrestling. Now, obviously, wrestling, you can't wrestle continuously for an hour. It's an anaerobic activity for sure. But it keeps the populace fit. And when you have Peloponnesian Wars, when you have the Persians invading modern-day Greece, when you have Alexander the Great of Macedonia, which is sort of this rocky, desolate area, north of Greece, sweeping the entire ancient world all the way to India. All this recreation stuff, let's get some burly people, men pretty much at that point, pretty able to swing a blade. And let's go see whom we can conquer and make them pay tribute to us, and so forth. So, Greek culture relied heavily on slaves, or enslaved peoples. Roman culture really relied heavily on enslaved peoples. And so this idea of Aristotle saying, well, recreation, leisure is freedom from the need to work. That sounds all well and good if you're one of the landed gentry and so forth. Moving forward a little bit, kind of skipping forward, we'll come back to ancient Greece here in a sec. Skipping forward to the Romans that conquered and took a lot of Greek ideas on how to be, how to live, how to conquer, and how to make lots of babies. Land was parceled out, citizenship was parceled out as a function of military service. So all this stuff gets wrapped up together. We'll talk about gladiatorial games as a form of leisure as well, okay? So the Greeks were one of the first cultures to really sort of sit down and think, or stand up and discuss in the market, the agora, the market of ideas as well as physical objects. Different senses of, okay, so how are we going to be? Now that we have clawed our way up from basic, purely subsistence living. Subsistence is working day in, day out, hard scrabble, clawing crops from the earth, hunter-gatherer style life. Now that we have any kind of a surplus of food, of labor, and of time and energy, we can think of it as literally as having enough calories to not starve continuously. They have a couple of different philosophical ideals of or views on things like leisure and, by extension, forced and outdoor recreation. Now, remember that the Greek pantheon, the Greek worldview, the Greek understanding of what reality is ordered by is centered on Mount where? Olympus. Vesuvius was a Roman thing.
Yeah, of course.
Close. Same area. Mount Olympus has crazy lightning storms atop it, like a lot of mountain ranges do. And so you have the thunder god up there ruling a pantheon of gods that are constantly turning into animals and then seducing people and backstabbing each other, and Zeus's daughter springing out of his forehead fully formed because puberty is awkward, and who wants to go through that if you're a god, right? So even as we are thinking about what are some philosophical, some pretty lofty and high-minded perspectives of what do we do with leisure, what do we do with anything that we're not spending on survival, is tempered by this worldview of the gods are out there, and there are lots of other warring cultures. We are constantly even fighting within our own peninsula, the Peloponnese, against other ancient Greek city-states, right? Spartans versus Athenians versus everybody else. I mean, it's top 10 anime betrayals constantly in this time period and in this part of the world. So, with these upcoming philosophies like cynicism, we have a sense of, okay, this all sounds pretty cool, but remember, these people are trying to stab each other kind of often. All right, so the Cynics focused on the empirical. The empirical is what you can see, what you can hear, touch, taste, and so forth out of your own senses. So these days, modern empirical research is that which we do by our own physical human senses and augmented by cybernetics, that is, digital sensors and so forth. All right, so the empirical is what's actually directly observable out there. Is the original sense of this cynic mindset. And so the basic pragmatic sense there is seeking pleasure. This wine tastes really good, and it doesn't make me die from uncontrollable diarrhea like drinking regular water does because of microorganisms that I don't know about. Seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, drives human behavior. Even these days, developmental psychologists talk about how young children, before they have like the physical brain matter, the physical part of the brain organ, to think about things like higher order considerations of ethics and beauty and purpose and spirituality, right? We are looking for the sweet treat. We are trying to avoid the spanking, for those of you who grew up with corporal punishment, and so forth, okay? And so the sense of this is life is nasty, brutish, and short, so you're not wrong by seeking pleasure. Having a nice Sunday afternoon at the temple with the temple prostitutes, like, that's kind of fine. It makes sense because what we see is all we can know, and therefore we see that the simple pleasures of eating good food and so forth make sense. But because they make sense and they drive human behavior, that becomes maladaptive, which is a 10-cent word of way of saying because humans tend to go after what we think of as immediately pleasurable, feeling the sun on our faces, not having to do back-breaking labor all day long, we can seek this too much. Make sense? We can overcompensate, we can maladapt to seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, to the extent that we sort of crowd out other higher order thinking. And so, material goods and pleasures like that are to be avoided because they're addictive. It's illegal. Okay. The skeptics, they don't even go that far. They don't trust sensory input in the same way. Like, if you ever had the sense that, the Matrix has you, Neo, that's a very skeptic, ancient Greek kind of sense of things. That is, since we can't really know what the spiritual truth behind what our eyes are lying to us about, behind what our hearts are lying to us about, ears are lying to us about, something that sounds good is ephemeral, it's transitory, it can't stay. Therefore, it is not ultimately true because it is temporary and transitory. Since what is really true, the spiritual truth behind things, cannot be known or seen or observed, therefore, go for a quiet life. Hedge your bets. Don't do anything super ambitious or grabby or stuff like jealousy. If you're jealous of your neighbors, whatever pleasures they've managed to cobble together, then that can pull you off track pretty quick. We'll see notes of this in Christian morality, Christian theology, 2,500 years later. So, therefore, it's enough to have a roof over your head. It's enough to have a small circle of people around you, your family, that you get along pretty okay with, and enough to live out your days till age 35 or 40. Call it good. Okay? The skeptics, they were real fun at parties, so they eventually got folded into Stoicism. Moving on. The Stoics, and living here in the Midwest, Stoicism, this is our jam. Like, this should resonate with us. We'll see. All right? Okay, Sarah. What will be, will be. You could get after it. It's like, well, we're all going to die. And it's fairly likely that most of our kids, or up to half of our kids, are going to die, like, before age 5. So, just kind of do what you can with what you got where you are, kind of a vibe. And, never forget you're going to die soon, right? So, align with nature. This is a very cyclical mindset. The Stoics are thinking along the lines of, okay, it's springtime. Yeah, it's kind of rainy and muddy out, and that's a pain in the ass. We're having to sweep out. We haven't invented Roombas yet, so we're actually like sweeping, the mud that we track into our terracotta homes and stuff like that. And summer's coming. It's gonna dry out, and we're gonna grow some foods. We're gonna harvest those foods later in the summer and into early autumn. and our Mediterranean climate. And then winter's coming. And we're going to take some time off from the harvest afterwards. We're going to rest up because next spring's coming. And we're going to do the same thing then. It's a very sort of steady state, almost like a plodding lifestyle, but one where simple, quiet pleasures at home are kind of emphasized in this mindset. Pleasure, seeking out pleasure for its own sake, going backpacking, going on a fun hunting trip instead of a subsistence hunting trip, more trouble than it's worth. Because Zeus is out there, and so is Hades, and like three-headed dogs and stuff like that, and nymphs trying to seduce you. Oh my goodness, like the ancient Greeks have all of these rich stories of a million different ways you can die pretty horrifically. If you think about the mythology of the ancient Greeks, man, nobody gets out. Jeez, it's rough. So, lots of fun at parties. On the other end of the spectrum, we do have the Epicureans and some other folks like the hedonists. So the Epicureans take a more spiritual take versus somebody like the Stoics, who are very sort of empirical. What do we see? That's not even the deeper reality, so we can't know. So let's live these quiet, sort of contented lives more than having any sort of sense of accomplishment or fun. The Epicureans are more along the lines of, look, we're free to enjoy leisure. This stuff isn't just pulling you down into green-eyed jealousy of your neighbor and everything they have that's nice. It's not wrong to enjoy good pleasures while living simply, in balance, but good food, good companionship, sort of a reasonable life well lived makes a lot of sense to Epicurus and his followers, the Epicureans. So we have this kind of multi-level sophistication on this very basic Stoic sense of leisure is bite-sized, it's cyclical, and it's probably in your home with your family. We have this sort of higher order philosophical sense of leisure, kind of like Aristotle was talking about, freedom from the responsibility to continuously work and so forth, and need to work. And then also that natural cyclical sense. So they're starting to sophisticate a little bit, starting to layer up some of these other ideas and say, yeah, we're going to borrow from a little from column A, a little from column B, and that's going to be our outlook. The hedonists crank it up to 11. And the hedonists were going hard in the opposite direction. I don't know. Maybe these were my homies back in the day who had ADHD, and they were more sort of dopamine seeking. Pleasure is a primary motivator instead of sort of an incidental thing to be caught in between like harvest and like winter tool repair and stuff like that. Okay? So get into the sensual. Sensual pursuits in this time period don't mean sexy times like they do now. It means the senses, right? What kind of cloth or fabric feels good against your skin? Let's go for that toga instead of like the coarse linsey woolsey kind of thing of other cultures and so forth. What tastes good, right? So the hedonic pursuits are much more of an intentional, clear focus on leisure as a higher order, as a good and even noble pursuit. Like, the gods didn't just put us here to farm and build stuff out of brick and stone. Rock and stone for all you deep rock black folks. Yeah. We're here for more than that. And so we're starting with the hedonists to get a sense of humans are meant for more than this purely cyclical agrarian life. Okay? Cyrus of Persia was a revolutionary Persian emperor that shows up in everybody's history. Let's pick it up with Cyrus of Persia on Thursday. We'll end about a minute early. I'm here for questions if you have them. Otherwise, we'll see you then.
Nice Spinal Tap reference.